So, one of the challenges all churches face is trying to keep people up to date on all that you have going on at your church. And so, today at Practical Church Planning, we're going to share with you 5 simple ways to keep people up to date at your church.
Thanks for joining us again today on Practical Church Planting. My name is Brian Androsian, and with me is Dylan Dodson. And today we're going to give you 5 simple ways to keep people up to date at your church.
And this episode is brought to you by Mission Support. Mission Support knows you want to be effective in ministry, but if you're like most pastors, you probably feel like you never have enough time, energy, or expertise to get everything done. And so Ministry Support comes alongside pastors as a guide to provide expertise to do the things you don't know how to do and give you back the time you desperately need. So whether it's bookkeeping, SEO, payroll, websites, or graphics, bumper videos, any one of their other services, you can talk with a guy today at missionsupport.com and go from feeling scattered to focused on your mission. It's possible to love being a pastor again. So again, check out missionsupport.com for more information. And if you tell them you heard about them on Practical Church Planning, whatever service you use them with, they'll give you 10% off.
Nice.
So missionsupport.com, tell them you heard about it on Practical Church Planning for an additional 10% off. Now, we're talking about simple ways to keep people up to date at your church. This one is more about like information and what's going on. And, there's lots of various things you want people to know about.
Yep.
The challenge is letting them actually know about it.
Yeah.
And so this is a couple different things you can do to be proactive. And, I feel like some of these things you might not have thought of. So that's what we're trying to do
not just the Well, we'll get to it. Yeah.
So here's the first one: add givers to your newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about in the past how we recommend sending out a weekly newsletter. Ours is pretty super basic, just upcoming events, pretty much that sort of thing. Let people know what's going on. The challenge is getting people on your newsletter.
Yeah.
So like if you fill out a Connect card at New City Church on your first Sunday or one of your we put it in there. But that's really like the only way we actually get it in there. Now, maybe like from time to time, if somebody asks, hey, I heard about this, or I'm not getting this, you could put it on there. But it's like, unless someone signs up for it, or maybe you have a form on your website, a lot of people just don't sign up for stuff. And so they don't know this information. So one of the things that I do is I go through on our online giving platform, Subsplash, because for us, most people give online, is from time to time, we'll go in there and you can pull out all the email addresses and just import them.
Mm-hmm.
We use MailChimp for our newsletter, but I'm sure you could do this with any software. Again, this is why we recommend using like a newsletter provider, not just keeping them stored in your email.
Yeah.
We could do this way. But if you haven't done this, what I would do is like, for example, I would go and click on all of your givers for this year. Because if it's like years ago, they don't probably care. But go to this year, it'll give you all the email addresses and you can like highlight all of them. And at least in MailChimp, you can import contacts, like a copy and paste model. And so I just copy and paste them all into MailChimp. And the ones that are duplicates, they don't add. Mm-hmm. But the ones that aren't get added in there. So I did this recently. I actually went through... I've been doing this last couple of months, but then I was like, I should actually do the whole year. Mm-hmm. And so especially if there's like a new giver as well, I'll always put the new giver's email in the newsletter. Again, they may already be signed up for it, so then it doesn't matter. But if not, especially if they're giving financially, it's always good to be proactive and letting things know what's happening in the life of your church.
Yeah.
And so adding givers to your newsletter is a way to get more people on your weekly newsletter who will probably be happy to be on it. They just don't know about it, or they've never signed up.
Yeah, and I think like church newsletters, people aren't exactly like rushing to get on them because sometimes they're inconsistent or sometimes they're not the greatest. But I don't think most people are actively trying not to. In other words, they just need a way to do so. But if you just say, hey, everyone sign up for the newsletter, I don't think most people are going to go home and follow the link to do it. And so this is the way to do it. And obviously, I think like if someone gives, obviously they give their contact information. I think they're assuming they're going to end up getting something back from the church or whoever, like some sort of correspondence back. But obviously, if they don't want it, they opt out. Like it's not a big deal. But I think being able to do that in MailChimp and maybe other providers do the same is like, you're the one that does it, so you can speak to it. But seems like a huge time saver rather than having to go through and like, is this person in there? I'm not sure. The fact that they won't add duplicates or that they'll check for it, you can just. I don't know how far back you go, but you could theoretically just do like the entire year every week or whatever, or every month,
Yeah. So that's what I would recommend. Maybe putting it on your to-do list like once a month after you've maybe done the last year.
Yeah.
And to add new givers. Because people they're not rushing to sign up for a church newsletter.
Yeah.
But if they've given you their information, then you should always add it. The only time we don't is like, we did Trunk or Treat recently. We did these sign-ups for like this raffle. I'm not going to put all those emails in our newsletter. That would be obnoxious and they didn't want it. So we follow up with them individually on that sort of thing. But again, if it's a partnership membership thing, if they drop their kids off on time, if they did a Connect card, like anytime you get emails from your own people, always put them in there.
Yeah.
And giving is a great way to do it. And so go to your online provider. You can even do this in Planning Center too, or whatever your church database as well, wherever you get your money or however you try to do that. Just highlight all of them, copy and paste it, import it into your newsletter, so that they can stay up to date on what's going on.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a little side tip.
Little pro tip.
Pro tip. Side tip. Pro tip. Add givers to your weekly newsletter. And again, in any function. So maybe you have people serving and you're not sure if they're on there. You can copy and paste any of them.
Oh, yeah.
And it won't, if it's duplicate, it won't add it. But, try to get people on there.
Yeah.
Number 2 is start your sermon with an important announcement if you can't preach it. So it's always, if you've got something you want people to know or to do or to sign up for, obviously in your announcement next step slot, you want to talk about it there, but it's always best if you can include it in the sermon, because then first of all, everybody's there. People are listening. If you do announcements, maybe in the beginning of the service, end of service, people have left or haven't arrived yet, or not paying attention.
Yep.
So you have it. You don't want to announce 3 things. This is one thing. And so ideally, you mention it somewhere in the service, but if it doesn't work naturally, I'm new to this. I didn't do this for a long time, but I've recently started doing this because if you listen to our episodes on preaching and that sort of thing, and how, especially I've got a pastor friend at their church, they start their sermon with the announcements. Like the pastor does them for 2 or 3 minutes. And I was like, you have to stop. You got to stop, because nobody it's the worst way to start a sermon. However, for example, we do once a quarter, we do our Discover lunch, which is if you want to join the church, here's who we are, what we believe, all that sort of stuff. Well, these last couple of weeks, as we were getting ready for Discover Lunch, there was nowhere to put it naturally in the sermon. But I wanted to communicate it, one, because I can communicate it better than whoever's doing next steps too, the reason behind it. And so I wanted them to hear a good reason, not just hey, it's coming up and you should sign up.
Right.
But it didn't fit naturally. And so because other pastors do this, they'll mention it at the beginning of the sermon, quick 30 seconds, whatever. But that way people hear from you, and you can explain it in case maybe the announcement person didn't say it the way, or they didn't say something you wanted them to say, or whatever.
Yeah.
And so starting your sermon with an important announcement, if you can't preach it, regardless, if you have something coming up, I would encourage you to put it in there. Maybe if you have a Christmas outreach event or whatever, that's or we did trunk or treat. There's no way to be hey, you should sign up to serve at trunk or treat in the middle of a sermon.
Yeah.
So stuff like that, it just doesn't fit naturally. Or maybe you're doing a serve push or community groups, things that you are really, really beneficial, and it just doesn't fit naturally in the sermon. I would start the first thing you do, I would do that. Now I would keep it 30 seconds or less. It's got to be quick. It can't be this long drawn out thing. You can put the graphic back up on the screen too if you want when you start, but say it so that people can hear it from you. And especially if it's something that's really important you want them to do, is to start your sermon with an important announcement if you can't preach it.
Yeah, and there's ways to do this good and ways to do this not great. And so just as we're recording this yesterday, you did this at the beginning of the sermon and was talking about our Discover lunch. And I think the way that you did it was good, because it was I don't remember the exact phrasing, but it was something along the lines of hey, just to reiterate or repeat, from next steps, today after service is this is the reason, and it was 20, 30 seconds long, but then got on with it. It wasn't here's some things coming up at New City, or if it wasn't like this. You didn't think that you were going to go into this long announcements portion, just by listening to it. You weren't pulling out notes of things coming up or things like that. And so the way I thought about it afterwards is, okay, because I've heard other churches do it the same way you're saying, of just a bunch of announcements at the beginning. And obviously this isn't can't happen in reality. But if I'm were to be communicating this, is someone, if they were listening in real life and they had the real life option of a 15 or 30 second jump, in a podcast, to jump ahead, would they know to jump ahead? Because if you say here's all the things coming up at the church immediately, it's okay, jump ahead. I care,
and
but
then you jump ahead too much.
And you jump ahead too much. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, totally.
But the way, if just kind of working in naturally, hey, just to repeat, this is coming up. This is why, and then get on with it. Not to be rushing through it, but just to only give the little highlights. I think you'll still keep people engaged, and they're not going to be oh, it's church announcement time, and then miss the first part of your actual sermon itself.
And just pro tip too, if you say, hey, real quick, it needs to be real quick.
Yeah.
It can't be like, or, at the end of the sermon, people are like, well, in a conclusion, and they talk for 10 more minutes. So
Yeah.
you don't want to do that sort of thing. And so I would just do it quickly, do it with energy, and move on. But definitely preach it, which you might know, hey, if something coming up, I should put in the sermon. But there's times in the past where it didn't fit, so I just didn't say it. I was like, that can't be the best solution.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when it comes to keeping people up to date with things going on, start the sermon, but do it very quickly. Like, it doesn't need to be a long, drawn-out thing, just to, again, reiterate and to catch the people that might have missed it earlier. Or if you need to explain it a little bit better than it was explained, by someone else, that can be important too.
Yeah,
So
yeah, for sure.
start the sermon with an important announcement if you can't preach it. Number 3, host a church business meeting over Zoom. Now, you might be like, we've been doing this for years.
Yeah, true.
If you are, congratulations.
Yeah.
We have not done this historically. I was trying to think recently of we have got some staff transitions coming up, but even regardless, even before this, I was like, man, I'd like to communicate with people what's going on, but there's really not a way to do this without boring people on a Sunday morning and that sort of thing. And depending on the background, if the church is more traditional, maybe they're used to coming back on Sunday night or Wednesday night, whatever. But in our case, if I were to do a Sunday night at 5, we're going to do like a typical business meeting, financials, updates, whatever. So few people would actually come to that.
Yeah.
And so I was like, let's do a Zoom meeting. So we're just for reference, we're calling this a quarterly all church Zoom meeting. This is the first time we've done it, and I think if we had just said Zoom meeting, it would have sounded like there's like a problem. So I don't know if it's going to be once a quarter. It probably will be, maybe even more frequently, because it's really simple and no one has to go anywhere and they can watch it later. But this is a way to keep people up to date. What's really important is you want to be as proactive as possible, letting people know things that are happening in your church, because people will trust you. They'll be like, oh, this church has thought things out. Like, it's just good. And so trying to find ways to do that. And so for us, here's our plan for it. We're going to do 20 minutes of information, and then I'll be answering whatever questions people want. Now I'm using Zoom Webinar because I have it for some personal webinar stuff that I've done that many of you have attended. So we have that option. The Zoom Webinar is different than Zoom Meeting, because in a Zoom Webinar, there's an option that, like, there's a Q&A. Like in a Zoom meeting call, you can do like the chat. People can chat. But in a webinar, there's a Q&A that nobody can see but the host or maybe the people that you give permission to see it. And so for us, our plan is to do 20 minutes. Typically, what I'll probably do in the future is a brief financial update, because we do a quarterly giving statement, so that, like, here's where we are, here's what we spent. This time I'm going to go over staff transitions to just some other information. I'm going to keep it to 20 minutes as best I can. And then the Q&A will be as long as people want it to be, and they can leave or whatever. But the Q&A, nobody can see it but me. So if somebody asks a question that's irrelevant or we just like take away from what's going on, it's a way to keep it on track without, I don't know, derailing it. And if I don't know the answer to, I can follow up with that person later, or say somebody asked this. Hey, this is a great question. I don't know, but this is a great way to get feedback on what people are wondering about at your church, what you're unclear on. And so I'm sure we will get some questions that have nothing to do necessarily with what's I'm talking about, but just the things that want to know. And so for us, we're doing a church business meeting, which I wouldn't call it a business meeting because that's very boring. But if you want to do something like that, and you're having a hard time getting people to come to stuff like this, doing it over Zoom can be helpful. And for us, that they register for it, so we have to get their email, and the form I use a third-party form, but anyway, they can ask questions ahead of time too. So I'll already have some questions if people submit them. And then going back with our very first one about adding it to the newsletter, after the Zoom meeting, I'm going to take all those emails and put it in our newsletter. And I'm sure we're going to get some people that haven't signed up for that.
For sure.
And so I'll do it that way. But a church business meeting over Zoom, it's our first one, but keeping it quick, and just the highlights is just a way to let people know what's coming up and, let them ask questions.
And this like allows you to disseminate information that it's like that weird middle ground between like an announcement from stage and something that is only to like that you really just tell people in person. Like, it's like, how do you fit stuff in between that? Because, there's some things like if we were to tell all the community group leaders, like, hey, communicate this. But there's some things like, no, we kind of want to be the ones to communicate it rather than kind of telling someone to tell somebody, because you don't really know how that's going to get translated. And so this is a good way to this is like the catch-all of all that extra information where, you may mention it in passing, but it's not going to be like, here's all the events coming up at the church. That might just be like, hey, just so you know, but that's not the point of it. But the point of it is, here's some other information, and especially if it's quarterly, no one is or at least on a semi-regular basis, no one is, like you said, thinking like, oh no, something terrible is happening because they're making us get on this thing. But just, hey, here's what's going on in the church. Here's kind of some things that the inner workings of the church that you might not know. And if you want to know, now you can know.
Yep.
It just helps add a little bit of transparency.
And that's the thing too. I don't think we're gonna have tons of people watch this.
Sure.
But it's like, hey, if you want to know, here it is. If you don't really care, then that's fine too. And it's nice too because we can send the replay out later. So part of them signing up is if they can't make it at 5 o'clock, they can watch it later. And they don't have to do all the Q&A, but they can know, hey, it's only going to take about 20 minutes because if it's an hour long, people watching it later is, a lot of people are probably going to do that.
Right. Yeah.
So that's a big benefit is that, if people don't care, at least they know you're being proactive, and the people that want to know will actually be there.
Yep.
And then as you were talking, there was something else I was going to say, but I can't remember.
Well, maybe this jogs. So I've never used Zoom webinar before. So
Okay.
is it similar to are you as the speaker, the presenter, the only one who's able to talk, or do you have to
Yes.
give permission to people?
Yeah, so it's a Zoom webinar, same thing as Zoom meeting. They'll get sent a link.
Yeah.
Webinar, you can't see everybody.
Yeah.
So
I
it
think
is
that's really-
different. It's like you don't have to mute or unmute because literally nobody can talk, and nobody gets shown on the screen.
Yeah. And so what I was going to say, that's what I thought, and that's what I wanted to make sure. But granted, it costs some money, but it's better than just doing a Zoom meeting because I think a lot less people would be like. Personally, I don't know if I would join every Zoom meeting if I know like I'm going to be on there. It's there's people trying to have like conversations, which obviously in Zoom it just means like everyone's listening to it, and sometimes Zoom etiquette is a little like. Not everyone's the best on Zoom. And so if you can do something like Zoom webinar or something along those lines where it's not just like, here's everyone in attendance. Everyone knows that, I don't know if it says how many attendees there are, but like everyone knows that there's only 5 people that showed up. I think that's something a lot better than just saying like, we're going to have a Zoom meeting.
I don't know. So if you're the host of the Zoom webinar, you can see the number of attendees. I don't know if you can or cannot.
Yeah.
I don't know if it shows the number. But that one thing I was going to say, so 2 things. So one, we're doing the webinar version. Let's say you're like a brand new church plant or launch team and you want to do this way and you only have 20 people on your team and you want to do the Zoom meeting because you want people to see, then do that. Like do whatever works for you. If you get a little bit bigger, it could potentially be awkward or weird, but whatever. Or if you don't want to pay for webinar, Zoom meeting, it's fine too.
Right.
The nice thing about this too is that if not a lot of people show up, it doesn't really matter because just being real, like we all know the discouragement of planning these events or doing something and like 3 people show up.
Yeah,
And it just feels you're discouraged. Even if the other people aren't, because they're not thinking about it like you are, they're like, oh, this was fine. Like if literally 10 people came to this Zoom webinar thing that I'm doing, like it wouldn't matter.
Right.
Because it wouldn't be this awkward thing. It's like whoever showed up. And I don't even know that people could even see how many attendees there are on their end.
Yeah.
But even if they could, it's like it's just not weird. It's not awkward. People didn't really drive and come out of their way. Like you just turn on the Zoom meeting probably while they're watching football, if we're being honest, and just listen to it. And so it's a doing something online like this when it's just kind of information stuff. You don't have to feel like you have to add something extra because if we were to do this in person, it's like we'd have to make it worthwhile. People coming, and if not that many people come, it'd be really discouraging when you do it online. That you take that element out of it, which can be nice.
Yeah, for sure.
So we'll report back how it goes, but that's our plan. We're doing that in 2 weeks. Well, I guess very soon after this episode is released.
Yeah,
a quarterly Zoom meeting to all church. We're calling it our quarterly all church Zoom meeting because a business meeting sounds boring.
Right.
And that's a way to get information and keep people up to date of what's going on. Number 4, be intentional about personally telling people things. So I think one of the ways that you can help let people know what's going on is like, even if they don't even ask, if they go to your church or whatever, especially if you're like the leader or one of the pastors on staff, like it can be really helpful for you just to tell people stuff, even if you haven't necessarily announced it on stage or it's in your newsletter or whatever, just to give you more information, because the more people know stuff and they hear it from you, they hear it accurately. So like with some of these staff transitions, I've talked to people about it, or like an event coming up, or I don't know, really anything. Don't feel weird like proactively bringing it up or waiting till Sunday or whatever, because it can be really helpful if they hear it from you. So if we've got, I don't know, like a chili cook-off thing coming up, and we got a bounce house. Like I've told people, hey, we're gonna have the bounce house, and I don't know if that's really. I don't really have really good concrete examples here, but not just relying on these things through the church, but you just like personally telling people in conversation. You might feel like weird because it's like, well, I'm telling this person, but I haven't told this person. I mean, but if it's not like a secretive stuff and it's just general knowledge anyway, the more you can proactively tell people in personal settings, that also helps people know what's going on.
Yeah, I think this is an easily overlooked one because it's like, our churches, say your church is 50 or 60 people or something, and it's like, how do I let all these people know? It's like, well, how many have you actually just like walked up and said, hey, did you know next week is whatever? Or do you know this is going on? And you can cover a lot of people that way. And it's not like you need to just like bounce around to everyone on Sunday morning saying like, did you know? But just in conversation, if you're meeting a newer person, it's okay to be like, hey, and if you want to come back next week, we're having our whatever chili cook-off, or we're having our thing this week, or
Yep.
it's just like it's a I think a very effective way of letting people know what's going on, but also kind of forget that it's the easiest option,
Yeah.
because you just bring it up and just mention it, and it's not like you got to dominate every conversation with it, but things naturally come up in conversation. Tell people about it, and people remember conversations.
Yeah, and I say this too because I don't know why, but it can feel a little maybe weird or awkward because you feel like you're telling somebody something that you're not telling someone else. But people talk too, so you
Yep.
know that if they're going to share the information, at least so they can hear it from you, it can be helpful.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would just say be intentional about letting people know what's going on or changes or even things that like they don't really know about. It's not that big of a deal, but the fact that people like to be in the know about things. So like we're getting our auditorium carpet redone, hopefully within the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Like I've just told people that. Like it's just kind of even though we would never like announce that from stage, like it's just kind of cool to know, and they can tell people that. Or like if the church is in a difficult place financially, like I wouldn't go on stage and be like, but like I have conversation, or maybe I wouldn't say it that way, but maybe there's like. So maybe you're raising money for something, or well, I don't know, but just like being honest about here's where the church is with this. Like maybe you wouldn't say this one-on-one with everybody, but it's like fine for people to know about it.
Yeah.
And you might not go into that detail. You're never going to go in much detail from like the stage or an email as you would in an in-person conversation. So I would just encourage that if there's stuff you want your people to know, even if you can't tell everyone or you don't talk with everybody so that you literally couldn't even if you wanted to, don't let that stop you from the conversations and the people that you do have or that you do know or you are communicating with, and just being proactive about telling them things that are going on or coming up at your church.
Yeah. And what you'll find is word will get out.
Yeah.
If it's just something, if you're just telling people things or telling people as you can, it's not like you're being selective of who hears it and who doesn't. But also people talk, and I don't mean like in a gossipy way,
Right.
but stuff will probably come up, and so there'll probably be a time where you go and tell someone, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I heard about that," and it's like, "Cool, all right." That means that people care about the church and they're talking about what's going on, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah. So to help people stay up to date what's going on, be intentional about personally telling people things as you're talking to them. And then number 5, last but not least, make sure your staff knows what's coming up. And this is increasingly important in a day and age where Zoom, online, people work from home, all these places. It can be really easy for not all your staff or maybe your volunteer leaders, like whoever your key people are that are helping your church function and run, for them not to know. And so even if it's not really relevant, because our we're a smaller church in our size relatively, and so like even if it doesn't have to do with like their department or what they're over, it's still good for them to know.
Yeah.
So like if our kids is having like a parents' night out, our worship person, like it's kind of irrelevant to them, but it's just good for them to know at a church our size, here's all the things that are happening. And so whatever that looks like for you, maybe in your staff meetings, having everyone kind of give an update, or if you know the church calendar, letting people stay up to date on what's happening. Because for us too, I have like in my office on the wall, it's really the only place that has all the upcoming events. We've tried like Google Calendar and stuff too, but not everyone's like looks at that in the future.
Right.
And so like I'll say, hey, here's what's coming up, just so that everybody knows, even if it's still like a month or 2 away, just so that people come up. So I would just make sure that your staff or your key leaders, however you structure, how you get stuff done at your church, know what's coming up, even if it's not relevant to them. The larger the church is, the less I feel like this matters. But when you're smaller, you're probably planning events around other events because you don't want people to come to multiple things, and you're not as segregated in terms of like, here's the kids ministry calendar and here's the students calendar and here's the all the things you have going on.
Yeah.
When you're smaller, people you do less things and more people percentage of your church would come to them. And so making sure your staff knows what's coming up and not just assuming or forgetting to tell them. Or even if you have something like a digital resource that a calendar, whatever, that people can access, they're probably not accessing it, ahead of time unless it actually pertains to them. So making sure your staff and leadership knows what's coming up as well is helpful.
And this goes back to the one right before, because hopefully it's not just you that's talking about these things to anyone. Like hopefully it just comes up in conversation with your staff as well, but it can't if they don't know about it. So in other words, just the parents' night out example, or like a kids ministry example, our worship leader right now doesn't have kids, so he wouldn't be like participating necessarily unless he's helping out, but he wouldn't be like attending necessarily. But other people on the worship team do, and he has a stronger relationship with most of them than probably the rest of us do. So it'd probably be more natural for him to mention it to them, or he may just in passing mention it to them anyways. and it may be as someone who isn't going to hear from someone else. And that not that that's the only way that they could hear about it, but that just helps add another layer of like communicating these details. And it's not that he would be like withholding information or not want to tell someone, but if he's not really aware of it because he doesn't really have a reason to necessarily keep up with their calendar, then that's not going to get brought up, and that just might be one less person that hears kind of another, I don't know, iterance of that announcement.
Yep. So making sure your staff and key leaders know, don't just assume that they'll check the calendar. And it's weird too. I've noticed more so this year, we don't typically do announcements for things more than 3 weeks out, but there are some things that people want to put on their calendars, even though they're not going to sign up for it or register it, they still want to know. So I've been trying to think through, how do you tell people stuff that's happening in advance, but not from stage? I mean, we could do the newsletter as well, but like trying to be, I don't know, I just heard, maybe it is a minority, but from time to time, like, I think they would want to plan around it, even though they're not actually going to put it on their calendar, but at least that they knew about it. I don't know. It's just this weird thing I've been trying to think through as I've heard people say, like, when is this thing? And even though it's like a little more of a month away. So I don't know. That's not really maybe relevant to this conversation, but
I think it's an ongoing problem with churches. I see it a lot of like, how do I just let people know about things that are coming up? And there's no one way. It's every way. And so all these things, it's like not just do one of them, but stack them all on top of each other and you'll cover as much ground as possible.
And I think too, going back to like the Zoom meeting, for example, so when I do this one in next week or whatever, whenever this is out, I'm going to talk about stuff that's like 6 weeks away. Even on stage, it's only 3 weeks away. Now, I'm not expecting anyone to sign up or whatever, but just for them to know, especially if it's like, like when our Christmas services are, like people do plan a little bit more proactively around that. Even if they don't put it on their calendar, they at least might come to mind when they're planning stuff. I was like, oh, wait, we talked about doing this at this time. So, you just want to let people know various different ways. And the point of this episode is to how to get more people that probably want to know what's going on, that information that they aren't getting otherwise.
Yep, exactly.
Those are 5 simple ways to keep people up to date at your church with what's going on. Again, if you are on Facebook and you haven't joined the Practical Church Planting Facebook group, so a lot of questions there. Also, missionsupport.com. Connect with them today. Tell them you heard about it from Practical Church Planting. You get 10% off. And if you want more free resources, practicalplanting.com is our website. And you can even check out our Growing Your Launch Team course, which is for people we would recommend 12 months or less from planting their church. We have a highly practical guide of walking you through exactly how to do that.
Yep.
That's all we got for this week. We'll be with you next week on Practical Church Planting.